I have shod near every horse that ever stood in tallow flat, and I am old enough now to tell you the truth of a thing without softening it. So I will start where it ought to start, which is the morning 4 men of the latter sea walked Esther Hale's saddle horses down the middle of our street like they had a right to them, and not one soul stepped off the boardwalk to stop it. I was at my forge with the doors flung open to let the heat out, and I heard them before I saw them. The slap of unshod hooves on hardpan, the laughing, the kind of laughing men do when they are doing a low thing and have decided beforehand that nobody will call them on it. There were 4 of Creed's riders, and there were 6 of Esther's horses on a string, good clean-legged animals she had broke herself. And walking behind the whole sorry parade was the widow on foot in the dust, hatless, her braid come loose, telling them in a voice that did not shake that those horses were hers, and that they knew it. Dolph Scarrett, who was Halloran Creed's foreman and the meanest piece of work I ever shook hands with, turned in his saddle and told her the horses had wandered onto Ladder Sea grass, and that strays were the Ladder Seas to gather. He said it loud for the street. He wanted the street to hear it. And the street heard it, and the street did nothing. I want to be honest about that, because it is the part I am most ashamed of and the part that matters most. There were 30 men within sound of her voice that morning. There was Prout the storekeeper in his apron in his doorway, and there was Loomis who ran the saloon, and there was the deputy Harlan Voss leaning in the jailhouse shade with his thumbs in his belt, and there was me with a hammer in my hand and a fire at my back, and we all of us watched a widow walk her own horses out of her own keeping, and we let the size of the Ladder Sea do our thinking for us. Creed ran 4,000 head and 40 riders, and he owned the bank's ear and the land office's patience, and a man with a forge and a family does the arithmetic quick. I did it quick. I am not proud of how quick. Esther got hold of the lead horse's halter at the foot of the street near my doors, and she set her boots and she held. She was not a big woman. She was wiry the way a person gets who works, brown to the wrists and pale above where the sleeve had always covered, with a chin she carried level and gray eyes that did not blink enough to be comfortable to lie to. Scarrett dallied the string to his horn and touched the spurs, and there was a moment where I thought he would simply drag her, and I believe he thought it too, and I believe he had decided he would, because that is the kind of man he was, and the Ladder Sea had taught him that the decision was free. That is the moment the stranger rode in. I did not know him then. None of us did. He came up the south road at a walk on a gunmetal gray gelding with a second horse on a lead, a man somewhere past 40 with a face like a dry riverbed, all of it run with the lines that weather and grief put there, and a flat-crowned hat pulled low, and a way of sitting a horse that told you he had sat a great many of them in a great many bad places, and had stopped expecting any of them to be the last. He took in the street the way you take in a card table you have just sat down to, the widow with her heels dug, the string dallied to the foreman's horn, the deputy in the shade, 30 men watching and not one moving. He rode the gray up easy and stopped it crosswise of Scarrett's horse, not fast, not a challenge yet, just a body of horse and man where Scarrett meant to go, and he looked down at the lead rope on the foreman's saddle and then up at the foreman's face, and he said one word. Enough. That was all. He did not raise his voice. He did not put a hand near the gun he wore. He said it the way you would say it to a dog worrying a thing it ought to leave, tired and certain, and the certainty was the frightening part, because a man who is certain has either nothing to lose or everything settled, and either way he is bad to push. Scarrett looked him over and did the arithmetic the rest of us had done and came out with a different answer, because Scarrett was used to numbers being on his side. "This ain't your trouble, mister." "It is now," the stranger said. "You've got 6 horses tied to your saddle and a woman in the dirt telling you they're hers, and I've watched a whole town agree with their boots that you're right. I'm new in. I don't owe anybody here a thing yet." He let that sit. Cut the string. "Lord." The stranger considered the word like it was a coin somebody'd handed him to bite. Or you'll have to do the thing you've been threatening to do in front of all these people who'll have to remember they saw it. Drag her. Go on. I'll watch too." His voice never went up. "Only difference is, after, you'll have one more thing to settle than you came to town with, and I don't sleep much, and I'm patient. I've got nowhere to be and the rest of my life to be there. I have turned that morning over 1,000 times, and I still cannot tell you exactly what shifted in Scarrett. It was not fear, not the plain kind. It was more like a gambler feeling the table tilt. He had come for a clean thing, humiliate the widow, take the stock, let the town watch and learn, and the stranger had made it dirty just by being willing. And a dirty thing in front of witnesses is expensive even for the latter. See, Creed liked clean. Everybody in 3 counties knew Creed liked clean. Scarrett cut the string. He did it spitting, with a knife, sawing the lead loose and letting the horses mill, and he said something to Esther I will not repeat low, that the street did not hear and the stranger did, and the stranger watched him say it the way you watch a man set down a marker you intend to collect on later. Then the latter rode out, the 4 of them, and the street breathed, and everybody found a reason to be very busy. Esther gathered her horses. She did it without looking at any of us, which was its own kind of slap and a deserved one. When she had them collected and haltered, she finally looked up at the stranger, still a horse, and there was nothing soft in her face, no swooning gratitude, just a hard, clear measuring, because she had learned what men's help cost and she was pricing him. "I didn't ask for that," she said. "No," he agreed. "I had it handled." He looked at the cut rope and at the dust on her skirt and at her bleaking lip where I think Scarrett's horse had shouldered her, and he did not insult her by arguing. "All right," he said. "You had it handled. I stuck my nose in. It won't happen twice unless you want it to." He touched his hat. "Where's water in this town a man can pay for honest." "The quarrel," she said. "Same as everyone. The town draws below my place." She said it like a test, watching to see if the name of her own land meant anything to him, if he was one more piece Creed had moved up the board. It plainly did not. He just nodded and asked where he could put up 2 horses, and I called across that I had stalls, and that is how Gideon Rourke came to board at my livery, and that is how I had a front row seat to all the rest of it. I will tell you what I learned about him slow, the way I learned it, because that is the only honest way to tell it. He paid a week ahead in coin, which marked him as either careful or not planning to stay. He brushed his own horses and would not let my boy do it. The gray he loved and the bay he tolerated, and both of them were better cared for than most men's children. He ate at Prute's counter and said little. He wore the gun like a tool, not a boast, and he wore an old line of pale scar from his jaw down under his collar that I never asked about. The second night he was here, when the saloon got loud and somebody started a fight, he got up and left rather than be near it. And I thought then that here was a man who had seen enough of the kind of trouble that ends in a man face down, and wanted no more of it, and was carrying it like a stone in his boot all the same. What I did not know yet, what came out in pieces over the weeks, was that Gideon Rourke had once worn a badge in a railhead town 2 territories east, and had been good at it, too good. The kind of good that makes a town lean on a man until they forget the man has a life of his own. He'd had a wife named Sarah and a son who'd lived 4 months. The fever came through one autumn the way fever does, no reason, no cure, and took the boy in a week and the wife in 2, while Rourke was off doing the town's hard work with the town's gun, and he came home to a quiet house and 2 new graves and a job that suddenly seemed to him the most worthless thing a man could spend his only life on. He hung the badge on a nail and rode out and had been riding out ever since, 11 years of it. Breaking horses for wages where he found them, because horses he understood, and horses had never once asked him to do a thing he'd have to answer for at a graveside. He had not meant to stop in Tallow Flat. He had meant to water and ride on. He told Esther all of this himself much later on her porch, and she told me much later than that, when we were both old and it was safe to tell. But I am getting ahead, and a thing told out of order loses its weight, so let me put it back in order and tell you about Esther's place, and the spring, and why Creed wanted her gone bad enough to do it in the open. Amos Hale had come into the valley before the town was much more than a notion, and he had done the one smart thing a poor man can do, which is pick the right ground first. The quarrel ran thin most of the year, a sometimes river, but up on the bench above where the town would later sit there was a spring. A true spring, cold and steady, that ran the worst of the summer when the river was a string of green puddles. Amos filed on the spring section and proved it up honest and built a way station there, a place where the stage changed teams and travelers could water, and a man could buy a meal and a bed. And he ran a little band of horses on the good grass the spring kept green, and he married Esther off a wagon train where her people had died of the cholera and left her with nothing but her hands, and he gave her a name and a roof, and in time, a daughter. Then a horse Amos was gentling went over backward in a bad spot, and that was the end of Amos, sudden as a snapped reed. And Esther was a widow at 28 with a 6-year-old girl named Pearl, a way station, a spring, and a band of half-broke horses, and every man in the county figured she'd sell inside the year. She did not sell. She ran the station. She broke the horses, and she could break a horse. I will not have anyone tell you a woman can't, because I watched her do it for years, and she had a better hand than 9 men in 10, patient and quiet and unafraid, which is the whole secret of it. She kept Amos's contract with the stage line. She raised Pearl. And she sat on the one steady water in a dry valley, which was fine and unremarkable right up until the latter sea's own springs ran low in a string of dry years. And Halloran Creed looked at his thirsty thousands of cattle, and then looked up the valley at a widow sitting on cold water. She used to keep 6 horses green, and decided that the natural order of things was for that water to belong to him. He offered to buy, she would not sell. He offered more, a foolish lot more, the kind of money that should have ended it. She would not sell, not because she was stubborn for its own sake, though the town decided to call it that, but because Amos was buried up on that bench under a cottonwood he'd planted, and because the spring was the one thing she had that was hers and not given to her by any man's mercy, and because she had figured out, clear-eyed, that a woman who sells the only thing that makes men careful of her has nothing left for them to be careful of. So Creed quit offering and started squeezing. That is the whole story of how the West got watered, if you want it plain. The fouled spring, the scattered stock, the rigged debt, the men in the street, those were just the squeeze taking its various shapes. And into the middle of the squeeze, on a gray horse, paying a week ahead, rode a man who had decided years ago he was done being any town's gun, and who could not, it turned out, watch a thing like that morning and ride on. He tried, though, I want that understood, he was not looking for it. He stayed 3 days, resting his horses, and on the 3rd evening he saddled the gray to leave, and he rode out the south road, and an hour later he rode back in. He never told me why, and I never asked. But the next morning he walked up to the spring bench, 4 miles on foot, because he said the gray had earned a rest, and he stood at Esther's corral fence watching her work a colt, and when she'd done with the colt she came over and he said, "You're short a hand. I break horses. I'll work for found and a fair wage, and I'll sleep in the barn, and the day you want me gone you say so, and I'm gone that hour." And before she could refuse it he added, "It's not charity. You've got 11 head that ought to be saddle broke before the snow, and one woman can't get to all of them and watch a child and run a station too. That's just arithmetic." She looked at him a long while. She was good at the long while. "Scarrett'll be back," she said. "Maybe more than Scarrett, you'd be in the middle of it." "I expect I would." "Why?" He thought about the question like it deserved thinking about, which I came to learn was his way with all of them. "Because I watched a whole town decide it was easier to be ashamed than to be in trouble," he said. "And I've been ashamed about as long as I care to be. That's the truth of it. It's not about you. You don't owe me a thing for it, and I'd take it kindly if you didn't try to." And Esther Hale, who had not trusted a man's offered help since she was old enough to learn what it usually cost, hired him. Not because she was won over. Because the arithmetic was right, and she was a woman who respected right arithmetic over a pretty speech, and because something in his flat refusal to be thanked told her this one might actually be what he claimed, which was a man with nothing to gain doing a thing because he could no longer stand not to. That is how it began, and it began slow, and I will not lie and make it a thing of glances and sighs, because it was not. It was work. He broke her horses. I would ride up Sundays. I had taken a shine to the whole business by then, and besides, Prute's wife sent baking and somebody had to carry it. And I would sit on the fence and watch Gideon Rourke gentle a green colt the way you talk a frightened child down off a roof. All time and no hurry, never a raised hand, and I would watch Esther watch him, and I will tell you what won her, if anything did. It was not that he was kind to her. It was that he was kind to the horses when he thought nobody was looking, and kind to Pearl without making a show of it, and that he never once in all those weeks asked Esther for a single thing, not a thank you, not a softening, not a place. He cleared the rules of the place out of her the first week, where to sleep, what to touch, what was hers and would stay hers, and then he lived inside those rules without complaint. And there is no courtship in the world that works on a wary woman like a man who simply, durably, keeps his word in small things day after day, until she stops bracing for the moment he breaks it. Pearl took to him before Esther did, the way children will. She was 7 by then, all elbows and questions, and she decided Gideon Rourke was the most interesting thing to arrive in her life since a litter of barn cats, and she followed him at his work and asked him 10,000 things, and he answered every one of them serious, like her questions were as good as a grown man's, which to a 7-year-old is the rarest gift there is. He whittled her a string of little horses out of pine, a whole band of them, and she lined them up on the porch rail and named them, and I noticed he carved them with care, the legs right, the heads right, a man who knew horses making them small for a child, and I noticed Esther noticing it too, standing in the door with a dish towel gone still in her hands. But Creed did not stop, and a love story that forgets the wolf at the door is a lie, so let me tell you about the wolf. The first thing was the water. About 3 weeks in, the spring went bad, not dry, fouled. The cold, sweet water gone to a stink that made the horses balk and turned Pearl sick the one morning she drank before anybody smelled it. Esther was up there at first light with a lantern and found it. A ladder C steer, freshly dead, dragged and dropped square in the spring's catch pool, bloating in the cold water, ruining all of it. A grown steer does not wander into a spring pool and lie down to die. Somebody had roped it and hauled it there in the dark and left it for her to find, and the message was plain. You cannot hold this water if we decide to spoil it, so you may as well sell us the spoiling. I watched a thing that morning I have never forgotten. Gideon Rourke went up to that pool and looked at the dead steer a long time, and I thought, here it comes. Here's where the badgeman comes back out of him and he rides for the ladder C with his gun. And he did not. He took off his shirt and he went down into that cold, filthy water, and he got a rope on the steer and he and I and the gray horse hauled it out. And then he spent the whole of 2 days digging, building a new lower catch below the spoiled pool, fitting flat rocks, working the springs flow off clean below the place they'd ruined, so that by the 3rd day there was cold, sweet water again, less of it, harder come by, but clean. He near broke himself doing it. And when it was done, he said to Esther, they want you to believe they can take this from you whenever they like. They can spoil it, but you can outwork the spoiling. They didn't count on that. Most folks they squeeze don't have it in them to dig 2 days in the cold. Make them keep finding out you do. That was the closest I ever heard him come to a speech, and I saw Esther change toward him in it, not soften exactly, harden alongside him, the way 2 pieces of iron get welded, which is by being hammered together hot. She started telling him things after that. The rigged debt, for one. Here was the rigged debt. Creed could not take the spring by spoiling it, so he went after it the legal way, which is always the West's favorite way once the dirty ways have failed. Amos Hale had, years back, borrowed against the station from the Tallow Flat Bank to buy out the stage contract, an honest loan, and he'd very near paid it off when the horse killed him, and Esther had been paying it down faithful ever since. But the bank was Creed's bank. He held the controlling note in it the way he held everything else. And that spring the bank found, suddenly, that there had been an error in the original papers, a clause about the water, and that the loan was in fact secured against the spring section entire and called the whole of it due. Pay in full by the autumn quarter day, or the section goes to auction to satisfy the debt. And an auction Creed's bank ran, on terms Creed's bank set, with Creed the only man in the county with the money and the want to bid, was just selling Esther her own front door to Halloran Creed with a lawyer's hand instead of Scarrett's knife. She'd had a lawyer's letter about it the week before the men ran her horses down the street. That, I learned later, was why she'd been so hard about handling things herself. She'd been frantic and proud and trying to find a way through it alone, and she had not found one, because there was not one to find inside the rules Creed had bought. Gideon listened to the whole of it sitting on her porch step one evening with Pearl asleep inside, and when she'd done, he was quiet a while, and then he said the thing that turned it. "You're fighting his fight," he said, "on his board, bank, auction, county judge that owes him, that's all his ground and he built it to win on. You won't beat him there." He turned his hat in his hands. "But Creed's not the only law there is. There's a federal land office, and there's a clause in the homestead patent your husband proved up under, and if that water was filed and proved as part of the original entry, not borrowed against after, but part of the patent itself, then a territorial bank clerk's pencil 11 years later doesn't get to quietly move it onto a loan. That's not Creed's ground. That's the United States ground, and Creed's money doesn't run the United States Land Office in the Capitol. It's slow and it's far, and it'd mean sending a man with the real papers to a place Creed can't reach. But it's a board he didn't build." "And who," Esther said, "is the man I send 400 miles with my only proof while Creed burns me out behind his back?" "Me," he said, "if you'll trust me with the papers, which you've got no reason to do, and I'll think no less of you if you don't." She did not answer that night. It was a great deal to ask of a woman to whom trust had only ever been a bill that came due. She sat with it a week, and in that week is where the story turns from a fight into a marriage, though neither of them would have called it that yet, because in that week Creed, sensing the legal squeeze about to slip, sent Scarrett to do the thing Gideon had named on the very first morning. He sent men to burn her out. They came at the dark of the moon. I was not there for it. I had it from Gideon and from Esther both, and the two accounts matched, which with those two careful people meant it was true. 4 riders' torches, meaning to fire the barn and the station house, and let the widow understand that proud was a thing the valley could not afford. But Gideon Rourke had slept 11 years like a man who expected the worst at every dark, and he was awake and out in the yard with a rifle before the first torch arced. And he did a thing I have always thought was the truest measure of him. He did not shoot a man. He could have. He was, I came to understand, a hand with a gun that the rest of us could only guess at, and 4 torch-carrying night riders silhouetted against their own fire are not a hard target for such a man, and the law of the territory would have called it a clean killing in defense of a home. 11 years before, the badgeman might have done it. But Gideon Rourke had decided at 2 graves that he was done spending his life turning men into more graves. And so what he did instead was shoot the torches. He shot the torch out of the first man's hand, and the second, fast as I can say it, 2 flat cracks in the dark, sparks flying. And then he put the next rounds into the dirt at the horses' feet so they reared and screamed and bolted, and into the water trough beside the third man so it burst and doused his fire. And he stood there in the yard reloading slow and easy where they could all see him, and he called out into the dark in that same tired, certain voice. "I can keep doing this all night and I haven't hit a one of you on purpose. Think hard on the man who can choose that. Now get off this woman's land." And they got. Burned nothing, killed nothing, left 2 good torches and a deal of pride in Esther Hale's yard, and rode back to tell Halloran Creed that the widow had hired a man who could shoot the cigarette out of your mouth and had chosen, on purpose, not to kill anybody, which is a far more unsettling thing to report to your boss than a dead rider, because a man who will kill you, you understand. A man who could and won't, who's choosing to leave you alive to think about it, that's a man you can't predict, and Creed, like all his kind, could not abide a thing he couldn't predict. In the morning Esther came out and saw the scorched grass and the busted trough and the two torches, and she found Gideon mending the trough as calm as a Sunday, and she stood there a while, and then she went into the house and came out with a flat oilcloth packet, and she put it in his hands. It was the patent and the original survey and Amos's filing receipts, the whole of her proof, the only copy, 400 miles of trust in a square of oilcloth. "Bring it back," she said. That was all. But you have to understand what it cost her to say it, and so did he, and he held the packet a moment like it weighed more than it did, and then he stowed it inside his shirt against his skin where no fire and no thief would get it without getting him first, and he said, "I'll bring it back, and I'll bring me back with it. You may not have wanted that part, but it's coming too." And for the first time since I'd known her, Esther Hale's mouth went soft, just at one corner, just for a second, before she put the hardness back on like a hat. He was gone 6 weeks. They were a long 6 weeks. Creed, I think, believed he'd run the man off, that the hired gun had taken his wages and lit out the way hired men do, and that the widow was alone again and the quarter day was coming and the auction was set, and that the whole thing would resolve itself by law the way clean things should. He left off the squeezing in those weeks. He didn't need it. The calendar was doing his work. And Esther held the place alone and broke the rest of the horses herself, and answered Pearl's daily question, "When's Gideon coming back?" with "when he's done," which was a truer answer than the child knew, and she did not let the town see her count the days. But I knew she counted them, because I'd ride up Sundays and the stack of whittled pine horses on the porch rail had a new one each week, and I understood after a while that Pearl was carving them now, badly, with Gideon's knife that he'd left for her. One a week, marking time, the only way a 7-year-old knows how to mark it, and that her mother let her keep them on the rail where she'd see them, which a hard, practical woman with no use for sentiment would not have done. Quarter day came on a bright cold morning in the back end of autumn, and the auction was set for noon on the steps of the Tallow Flat Bank, and that is the morning the whole thing came to its head, and it is the morning I am proudest of, because it is the morning the town I was ashamed of finally stood up. It did not start brave. It started with the bank steps and the auctioneer Creed had brought in from the county seat, and Creed himself there in a good coat. Not gloating, just present, the way a man is present at a thing he considers already settled and merely tedious. Scarrett and a half-dozen ladder C riders along the boardwalk in case. And Esther Hale standing at the bottom of the steps with Pearl's hand in hers and her chin level, there to watch them sell her home because she would not give them the satisfaction of being absent. And around the square the town, 30, 40 of us, doing what we did best, which was watch and be ashamed. The auctioneer read the notice. The debt, the default, the section to be sold, and here he read it out, the spring section, the water, the way station, the home, to satisfy the bank's claim, sold to the highest bidder, terms cash. And he asked for an opening bid, and Creed, not even troubling to stand, raised one finger, and the auctioneer named a figure that was 1/10 of what the place was worth and asked was there any other bid, and the square was silent, and I felt the silence the way you feel a held breath, and I will tell you that I had got as far as deciding I would bid. I, a liveryman with $11 to my name, bid against Halloran Creed just to make him spend more and feel the town's eyes on him. When up the South Road at a long trot came a gunmetal gray horse. Gideon Rourke rode into the square dusty to the eyebrows, 6 weeks of road on him, and he did not go for his gun and he did not call out a challenge. He rode up to the bank steps and he got down stiff, and he handed the auctioneer a thick fold of papers tied in legal ribbon, and he said loud for the square, Federal Land Office filing. The water and the section are part of the original homestead patent, proved and patented under the United States, 11 years back by Amos Hale, deceased. They were never the banks to lend against, and they are not the banks to sell. This says so over the seal of the territory and the land commissioner, and there's a U.S. Marshal a day behind me on the stage who will say so too, with a writ, and a deal of questions for the man whose bank moved patented federal water onto a private note with a pencil. You could have heard a moth land. The auctioneer read the papers. He was an honest enough man, just a hired voice, and I watched his face go from bored to careful to a little sick, and he looked up at Halloran Creed, and Creed looked back at him, and the whole square watched Creed do the one piece of arithmetic he had never had to do before, which was the cost of a thing going wrong in front of 40 witnesses with a federal marshal on the stage. Scarrett's hand went toward his hip. And here is the morning the town stood up, and I will name them because they deserve naming. Prout the storekeeper stepped off the boardwalk into the square, just stepped down into the open, where Scarrett could see him and stood. Then Loomis the saloon man stepped down. Then the Hendry brothers from the freight yard. Then me, I will not leave myself out. I stepped down too, with my hammer still in my apron loop. And it was the least brave thing I have ever done, and it felt like the bravest. And one by one, the men of Tallow Flat stepped off the boardwalk into the square, until there were 30 of us standing in the open between the ladder C and the widow. Not armed, most of us. Just there. Just no longer willing to be ashamed. And the thing about a hired gun like Scarrett is that he is paid to handle one man. Or two, or even a knot of them. But he is not paid enough to handle a whole town that has decided to stop watching, and there is not money enough in the West to pay him for it. Scarrett's hand came off his hip. Halloran Creed stood up then. He was not a fool, whatever else. He looked at the papers in the auctioneer's hand and the marshal on the road and the town in the square, and he saw the board flip. The board Gideon had named. Creed's money ran the bank and the county and the squeeze. But it did not run the United States, and it did not, any longer, run Tallow Flat. And a man like Creed knows the difference between a fight he can win expensive and a fight he simply cannot win at any price. He put on his hat. He told the auctioneer the bank would, of course, withdraw the sale pending review of the federal filing, in the smooth voice of a man pretending the whole thing had been a clerk's honest error all along. And he walked to his buggy and he drove out of Tallow Flat, and he never did get the spring. And within a few years the dry cycle broke and his own springs filled and he didn't need it anyhow. And he died rich and old, and I do not think one soul mourned him, which is the only justice the meek generally get in this life, but it is something. The marshal did come the next day on the stage, and there were questions for the bank, and a clerk lost his place. And the loan was set right, proved paid, in fact, near enough that Esther cleared it that winter and held a clean patent over her own front door for the rest of her life. But all that was paperwork. The thing happened in the square. I should end on Gideon and Esther, because that is the story you came for. But I find I have to tell it the way it happened, which is quiet, because they were quiet people and they would not forgive me a flowery thing. When the square broke up, he found her at the foot of the steps. He was filthy and swaying with 6 weeks of road. Pearl had let go her mother's hand and run at him, and he'd caught her up, and she was already telling him about the pine horses she'd carved, holding one up, and he was admiring it as serious as ever. And over the child's head he looked at Esther, and Esther looked at him, and there was a long while, because they were both good at the long while. "You came back," she said. "Told you I would, both parts." He set Pearl down. The papers and the man, the first part's done. He stood there with his hat in his hand, road beat, asking nothing, the way he'd asked nothing from the start. "The second part's yours to say yes or no to. I'd not have you take it for the help. The help was free. The man's a separate matter and you owe him nothing for the other." And Esther Hale, who had not let a man's help go unpriced since she was a girl, who had married once for a roof and buried him under a cottonwood and learned to need nobody, looked at this grief-worn drifter who had stepped between her and the whole weight of the ladder C and asked her for not one thing in return. And she did the bravest thing in the whole story, braver than the square, because it cost her more. She reached out and took his hand. She said, "Not for the horses, not for the spring. We've got those held now, the both of them, on my paper, and they'll stay mine. I'll have that understood. I've buried one man's roof over my head, and I'll not be given another's. The land's mine, and the spring's mine, and Pearl's mine. But the house is big, and the winters are long, and that grave under the cottonwood has been lonesome 11 years, and so, I'd guess, have you. Her chin stayed level, but her voice did not quite. Stay because I'm asking you to. That's the only reason I've got to give, and the only one I'll take. And Gideon Rourke, who had ridden away from love at 2 graves and ridden out for 11 years sooner than risk standing at a third, closed his rough hand over her brown one, and the man who never said much said the only thing left to say. "All right," he said, "I'll stay." They married that next spring under the cottonwood, with Amos's grave for a witness, which some folks thought strange and which I thought was the rightest thing I ever saw, because Esther was not a woman to pretend a thing hadn't been, and Amos had given her her start, and she'd give him a nod even from her second wedding. And Gideon, who understood grief better than any man I knew, stood beside her at that grave with no jealousy in him at all, only a kind of fellowship. 2 people who'd loved and lost, making room at last for loving again. I shod their horses for 30 more years. Pearl grew up and broke horses better than either of them, and married a good man and stayed in the valley. Gideon never wore a gun in anger again that I knew of, though he kept his hand, and the one time a drunk drover got rough with a girl in Loomis's saloon, it was Gideon who came in quiet and said, "Enough," in that same tired, certain voice, and the whole place went still, because the story of the night he shot 4 torches and chose to kill nobody had become the kind of thing the valley told, and a man with that kind of story doesn't have to raise his voice ever again. He and Esther grew old on the bench above the town, with the spring running cold and sweet below them, and I would ride up Sundays till my own knees gave out, and I will tell you the picture I keep, because it is the truest end I have. The 2 of them on the porch in the long gold evening, both gone gray. Esther mending tack with her brown hands, and Gideon whittling, still whittling. A whole new generation of pine horses for the grandchildren now, and neither of them saying much, because they never did. 2 hard, quiet people who'd each been certain they were done with this life's warmth and had been wrong, sitting in it, easy at last, the spring they'd held together running clean in the dark below. I am old now, and most of the men who stood in that square are under the ground, and I find I am not ashamed any more of how slow we were to step down off that boardwalk, because we did step down in the end, and a town that stands up late is still a town that stands up, and it took a stranger riding in on a gray horse and saying one word to teach us how. Enough. He only ever needed the one. And I have carried it 60 years, and I will tell it to anyone who will sit still, because the worst thing in that whole valley was never Halloran Creed or his hired knives. It was 30 good men watching from the shade and calling it good sense. And the best thing was the morning we quit. That is the whole of it, as true as I can tell it. A widow who would not sell her water, and a grieving man who could not ride on, and a town that found its spine, and a home built up out of all of it on a bench above the quarrel, cold water running below, a cottonwood and 2 graves grown old and at peace, and the long gold evenings, and the pine horses on the rail. He stayed, that was the promise, and he kept it, the way he kept all of them day after day in the small things until the end. He stayed.